I'm Dylan Marma, and you're listening to Operators and Allocators, a podcast dedicated to exploring how to make smart investment decisions and execute well in real estate and private equity. We'll be interviewing top-notch sponsors from various asset classes to understand how they think and the frameworks that they put in place with the goal of achieving above-average risk-adjusted returns. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Operators and Allocators. I am really excited for today's show. We have a gentleman who's going to be sharing with us, I know, a lot of gold nuggets when it comes to real estate investing, real estate development. He's someone that I reach out to frequently to be able to pick his brain, and he's been a huge help to me and become a good friend over the last 4 or 5 years or so. So really excited to welcome Mr. Evan Holladay to the show. How's it going, Evan?
Yes, great to have me, or great to be on, Dylan. I appreciate that, man.
I'm excited to have you here. So just a bit of background on Evan. Evan is the founder and CEO of Holladay Ventures, and he's a real estate developer and investor with over $300 million in experience and 1,400 plus units of multifamily real estate that has been developed and invested into, both on buying existing acquisitions as well as building from scratch. He's done a lot of market rate stuff in addition to a lot of affordable stuff, which I think he's created a really nice niche for himself there. Evan found his passion for real estate investing while going to school at University of Louisville. And then he took that and he went on to work for an experienced real estate developer that helped show him the ropes and build a foundation. And then he went off to take the leap of faith to build his own firm several years back. And it's just been amazing to watch his growth since doing so. So again, I think we have a lot to learn from him. And Evan, why don't you share with us how you got your start?
Yeah, thank you again, Dylan. So really, like Dylan summarized very well there, I kind of fell into real estate in college. I was going down the pre-med route and realized that was not for me. But I found real estate and I saw a developer developing student housing, worked for him. Then myself and a few others in college, we started a modular development company in college. Didn't know anything about what we were doing, but just kind of, fell into it, took action, found mentors, and learned as we went. And that's where I just fell in love with real estate. And I fell in love with affordable housing and impact-driven real estate development. Because I worked in student housing in college, and I was like, well, this is fun, but I want to do more than just build high-end luxury housing for students or, for people that can easily afford it. I want to actually figure out a way that we can provide affordably priced housing that's quality, that's well done, to families that may not normally be able to afford that and be able to live in a higher quality standard of living in a place to call home. And so that's where I stumbled into the whole world and the niche, like you mentioned earlier, of affordable housing. And I really just fell in love with it. And so that's really been my focus over the last 10 plus years, has been quality, well done, affordably priced living in communities. And we really focus in on mixed use communities and also sustainably developed and designed buildings, and also very innovative buildings. And so looking at how can we, as a taking a 360 approach to development, how can we actually think about the residents, the community, and our impact investors, and make something that's a win-win-win. And so we've been very fortunate, very blessed. The last 3-4 years, we've really gained a lot of momentum behind what we're doing, and really trying to make this into a movement behind affordably priced housing and attainable housing, as we like to call it. It's a little bit better. What's the word? A little bit better picture in people's head than affordable housing. Sometimes people have negative connotations of affordable housing, unfortunately, because of, prior public housing from the 1960s. But that's not at all what we're building. We're building brand new quality.
These aren't projects, right? I think people think of projects and affordable housing.
Yeah, exactly. That's, people think of, they're bringing in crime, they're bringing in ghetto. It's like, no, we're bringing in firemen, policemen, teachers, retail workers, your server at your restaurant. Like,
totally,
we're bringing in the backbone of the economy. That's who we're housing, and we're housing them. Like, we're based here in Nashville. We're providing rents for $850 to $1,200 a month for brand new 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms, where the existing market rate, like the what we would get for our same communities if we were market rate, would be in the ballpark of like $1,800 to $2,400 a month. And so it's just night and day difference on the rental range of what our residents are paying. So that's what's exciting about what we do. It takes a lot of creative financing as well, and a lot of patience, like you and I were talking about before we hopped on. Like, development is full of having to wait for things and constantly pushing a million different things forward very slowly. But that it's very rewarding when we get to see one of our developments built and some of our residents be able to move into their new home.
Yeah, we were just speaking about how we're getting into a few expansion and development type projects, and for me, that's a skill set that I know I need to work on, because there's so much back and forth and so many different moving pieces that you have to be extremely patient working with counties, things along those lines. But what I really like about you and admire about you is that you are definitely a visionary, and you definitely are painting a bigger picture to your team, your investors, to everyone around you, than simply, hey, look at the numbers, right? Look at the cash on cash return, the equity multiple, and I think that the numbers, with a big enough purpose behind you, I think the numbers will fall into alignment, right? Obviously, you have to make sure a deal checks out financially, but by thinking about the impact, calling it attainable housing rather than affordable housing, right? I think the mission is bigger than that, and I think that helps provide the fuel that you need, right? The motivation, the fuel you need, and the team needs to be able to go out there and really execute well on these projects. So maybe you want to speak to that a little bit in terms of how that plays out, and in all of the projects that you do. Just what does that do for the people around you by having a bigger picture, and how's that impacted you so far?
Yeah. I love that you brought that up, and because it really is honestly what we're trying to do, and it's all the way in our in our business plan, and what we talk about as a team as we goal set. Like, we're constantly talking about this as a team. We talk about it at least once a week in our team meetings. Like, how can we expand what we're doing into a movement outside of just what we're doing? Like, how can we, like, we've started to teach others how to do affordable housing. We've started to create community around that. So now we have developers that we're helping teach and mentor throughout the country, literally from all 4 corners of the country. We're creating also free education on YouTube and podcasts like this, like trying to share, pull back the kimono and say, hey, look, this is how affordable housing's done. And this is how we can do it more quickly. This is how we can create more units. Like, just sharing any ideas and experience that we have from the 1,000+ units that we've done. Like, how can we teach others how to do this, and how can we share? Because at the end of the day, I think a lot, at least within the affordable world and within the real estate development world, there's really not too many people talking about how we do what we do. And, I was fortunate. I started working for, I didn't know anything at the beginning when I was in college, but I just started working for developers. And that's how I kind of snuck in the back door and got to learn this industry, and worked for one of the top affordable developers in the country. And that was like the best way that I could pick up this business, outside of, there being free education or somebody teaching this knowledge and sharing this knowledge. And so we thought, well, we really are passionate about this. We really want to create a movement behind this. And we know, especially right now with the pandemic and COVID and all the impact that has had on our real estate market. I mean, we're all talking about how crazy real estate prices are, from both for sale and for rent. Like, rents are just skyrocketing, and affordable housing was already an issue prior to COVID happening. Like, even there was a study done in 2019 that said we needed over 7.4 million, I believe that's the number, 7.4 million affordable homes were needed that were in lack of supply. Well, that was pre-COVID. I don't even know what that number is today, but we just have a massive, massive need across the country. And so, it gets me excited, and, I love talking about it, and I love sharing the energy. But yeah, I think that's really what keeps us all motivated and gets us all excited to be
Yeah.
like, hey, we're doing something bigger than ourselves here and really trying to make an impact here.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest issues that we're facing as a country, period, right? The government is trying to solve for it. The developers are trying to solve for it. There is so much of a shortage of housing in general, and especially when we talk about affordable housing, there's so much of a shortage going on across the country that every developer that is building today, if they're building at their fullest capacity right now, we're not able to solve for it, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
there has to be additional incentives to be able to effectively solve for this. So I don't think people realize that, because a lot of people right now are talking multifamily, right? Everyone's seeing that it's all over the place, right? It's clearly a good investment. But I think people sometimes lose sight of why cap rates are so low, why rents are going up so fast. It's because
Yeah.
of just the basic principles of
Yeah.
supply and
Basics.
demand. You don't have enough supply.
Yeah.
You can't build enough supply fast enough to be able to support the increasing demand. And that's what's leading to this being one of the absolute best investments in today's day and age, even at these lower cap rates, because you have so much additional upside potential and runway and security, most importantly, right? Because at the end of the day, it's all about risk. And one of the biggest risks in any asset type is it being overbuilt, right? And having the supply and demand go out of whack. And I think we have a lot of things pushing in our favor there. Now, what I think the trending topic often is, how do we obtain making housing affordable, right? And there are numerous trains of thought in terms of how we go about getting there. And I think one of the ways in which, one of the suggestions in which usually politicians will bring to surface is, well, we can just cause rent control and just force housing to be affordable. So maybe you can break down how you build affordable housing in your case, just how the process works as a whole, and what you believe the most effective way to be able to truly incentivize developers to be able to fill the void and create the supply needed is.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up, and the also rent control. I think that's another like a basics of economics. Like if you cap the demand for something, then you are ultimately going to lower the supply, the new supply being created, because there's going to be a disincentive to create new supply. So then you're going to actually only exacerbate the problem by causing rent control. And that's another one of those like economics 101 things where it really comes down to supply and demand. But I think really to solve this problem, or at least try to make a dent in this problem, and you hit on it, is like we're clearly just not building enough. Like we haven't been building as much as we did from the 60s to the early 2000s. Like we have not been building that much since the end of like the 0809 crash. So since like 2010, or really 2008 until 2022, we haven't even reached back up to the average of where we were from the 60s to the 2000s. And so, we're growing, and more people are moving to cities, and cities are growing, and yet we can't build fast enough. We can't even get back up to our average of where we were before. So it's almost like, even if we literally doubled our production across the country, which is probably impossible at this point in time, given the way our politics work, the permits work, the construction cycle works, the financing cycle works. That's what's causing the problem, is supply and demand. But I think there's a couple different ways that can fix it. I think number one is just create more units, make it easier to create more units. The biggest roadblocks for developers and creating units is typically politics. So local politics that will slow down zonings, that will slow down development approvals. That's something, honestly, we deal with a lot. A lot of the already zoned multifamily land has already been developed. And so developers like myself, who, as cities are growing, their zoning can't keep up with the amount of density they actually need. And so we have to go in and rezone properties and gain the local community support. Well, usually as cities are growing, more people are moving there, but the people that have already been there don't want a city to grow or expand. And so those are what we call NIMBYs, or not in my backyard. That's one of the biggest issues that we face, is from communities and from community leaders like city council members who just don't want any new development, even if it supports, like we talked about earlier, the backbone of their economy that they benefit from. And even people that they know, sometimes people in their own family or their friends could benefit from affordable housing, but yet they are against it because it's going to change their neighborhood and bring something that they never thought would come to their neighborhood in a new development. And so that's one of the biggest things that I think, if there's a way to unlock higher zoning or density, or just allow density along certain corridors even, that would unlock a whole lot more development and would allow it to expedite the process of development, because rezoning can take up to a year or more in certain cities. And so that just slows down the process from, an idea of creating multifamily to actually seeing units built. And then I think the other thing is really, it's financing and incentives for developers. That's how we use right now. That's how we create our developments. The majority of developments we do are public-private partnerships. So we usually get affordable housing tax credits from the federal government, who it runs through the state housing agency, but they have a limited number of resources of those credits and the bonds that we use. So that's another thing too, is expanding those resources, because it's currently capped, and we're usually, like, across the country right now, every state is running out of credits and bonds because there's such high demand. They're using every single penny that they have. And so increasing that supply of incentive for developers like myself. And then I think lastly, I think it's figuring out construction, figuring out ways to incentivize innovation in construction. We've been building, a frame style building, stick built construction, as they call it, for the last 100+ years. And there hasn't really been a whole lot of innovation as far as how we actually more quickly build construction and build in that process. So right now it takes us, literally 2 to 3 years on the pre-development side. So rezoning, permitting, and financing. And then it takes us another 2 to 3 years to build it and lease it up. And so you're looking at like a 4 to 6 year process from idea to actually 100% occupancy, which, obviously what we're building today won't actually hit the market for another couple of years. And so that's another thing too, is it's just a very slow process. So any way that we can, like modular, there's 3D printing, there's a bunch of different ideas, but if the construction industry, they're typically the slowest one of the development group or the development team to be able to, or want to adopt new innovative construction systems and processes, that would make a huge difference as well. And then one last idea I think would be like anything as far as like being more more creative with our building uses. So what I mean by that is like encouraging accessory dwelling units, or encouraging people to split up their house into a duplex or a triplex. That's an easy way to immediately add new units that, it's an already existing building. And it's literally just turning it into more units than it already was before, and encouraging that would bring units online very quickly. And there's actually a friend of mine who I had on Monumental. They have a company called Pad Split, and they literally help real estate investors who own typically single family homes turn a 2-bed house. They will help them figure out how to turn their living room or their dining room into an extra bedroom. And so they can offer that, dining room bedroom that they wall off and put a door on, offer that to somebody for $500 a month. And that's super affordable housing. And it creates technically, another bedroom, another unit for somebody. So I think there's innovative ideas out there. We just have to be pushing all of them all at the same time.
Right. Yeah. We're definitely on the same wavelength. I think I was writing out modular and 3D printing to talk about that at the same time that you had been mentioning it. But yeah, I think there are definitely a lot of options, but I want to take a step back to, when you talked about the 1960s and the 2000s, and then you look forward into today and you think, why was there enough supply being built back then? What comes to mind initially for me is largely that back before a certain time, I think 1980s or so, a lot of developers were getting loans for 100% of the development itself, right? So,
Yeah.
so you had a much lower cost of capital, right? Which makes being able to get a return on your investment much higher, right? Today, you usually have a loan that's 70% of loan to cost, maybe 80% if you're lucky, right? But you're still having to bring in equity, and you have a higher cost of capital. Also, to your point of the red tape, if you look back, there's
Yes.
plenty of counties around the entire country that didn't have zoning codes
Yeah.
until
Didn't have permitting.
just a couple decades ago, right? This all just came about very, very recently.
Yep.
To where you could really go out there and you could probably reduce that 2 to 3 years of pre-development timeline
Yes.
by 75%, right? To where you're getting going right away. What do you think?
Have you read Trammell Crow Master Builder?
I have not.
Okay, so that I definitely recommend that for you and for everybody listening. But he basically in the 70s became, in a matter of like 10 years, became literally the world's biggest developer, like biggest scale developer. He mainly did industrial or flex space buildings at that time, then scaled into office and towers and multifamily. But he got his start in, I believe it was Houston or Dallas. He got his start in Dallas. But just reading that book, it was mind blowing to me how quickly he could get a building from like getting the land under contract to starting construction was like the matter of months. Within like 60 or 90 days, he could start construction. Whereas us, it takes us years now. And it's because of what you said. It's like there was no zoning, there was no use, use requirements, there was no codes, there was no permits. It was just like, hey, you want to build a box? Okay, go ahead. Here's your stamped approval. Like it was so much easier back then. So I think that's honestly a big part of it is like, how do we lessen the red tape that we've basically built up into our like bureaucracy system of cities and approvals?
Because when you have that red tape and you add an extra 2 years to the process, you're also adding more risk to the process, right? You're adding financing risk. How do you make sure the project gets financed? You're making sure you're not sure about where the market cycle is going to be in 4 to 6 years versus if it was built in the next 12 to 24 months, right? You can have much more certainty on a shorter runway. So now you have to demand an even higher return, right? To be able to make sense of it. And it's pretty wild stuff to think about. And it makes, it definitely makes a lot of sense. I really want to just have you break down sort of the basics on affordable housing, because I think people understand to some degree that the government can offer incentives via tax credits, but maybe just break that down just, so that anyone can understand the basics of it. Like what's the simplest way you can explain, like how does the government currently incentivize affordable housing and what's your preferred route?
Yeah, so the route that we typically use for affordable housing developments, we use what they call affordable housing tax credit. It's also known as the low income housing tax credit, or LIHTC. Again, I don't like calling it that because I think it's just a bad name for what it actually creates. But this tax credit comes through the federal government. They give that responsibility of allocating the credits to a state housing agency. So each state basically puts out a rule book called a QAP, or Qualified Allocation Plan. And the QAP basically says, these are the types of projects we want to see built. And this is our point system for awarding the limited amount of credits and bonds that we have. And so what we do is, as developers, is we go out and find the sites and the locations that we know are going to score well. We assemble the funding, we get the zoning done, we basically get the project ready to go. And then we apply for the funding with the state agency. And then they will allocate the funds based on scoring and criteria and meeting their threshold requirements. And then in return, so we'll get credits that will cover roughly 40% of our development costs. And so in return, we will cap our rents for individuals and families making 60% of the area median income, or AMI. So in Nashville, I think the area median income is like 79,000, and 60% of that is somewhere around 50,000. And so,
which is still a good income, like you're saying, for retail, teachers, all the essential workers that we have in our economies, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of families that are making in that 60% income range. And that also varies based on your household size. So they vary it from, like, if you're an individual, you're making 36,000 a year, up to a family of four, I believe that's like 58,000 a year. So
Mhm.
it's within that range that we serve families within the Nashville MSA or Metro Statistical Area. So within Nashville, I don't know the exact percentage of how many families fit in that, but it is a large portion of Nashville that actually fits within that income band. And so currently there's like 50,000 units that are actually needed just in Nashville at that income range. And we're probably building about 1,200 a year at that income range. And so we, in return for getting the credits, which are covering 40% of our costs, we are agreeing to offer basically a rent level to those 60% AMI residents that is no more than 30% of their monthly paycheck. So if they're making, let's just say for easy numbers, $1,000 a month, then they would pay no more than $300 in rent per month. So it helps cap it, makes sure basically that they're not overspending on their monthly paycheck toward rent and toward their household living expenses. And so typically most families that aren't in affordable housing are spending anywhere from 50 to 75% of their monthly paycheck just to live, just to like have a house. And that's what's part of the problem, is they don't have any money for food, for healthcare, for school, for books, for anything to help, daycare, even to help raise a family. And so that's really the arrangement, is we as developers get credits, which we actually then sell to banks or different investment groups. They'll give us
It's like
cash.
90 cents on a dollar, right? If for every dollar for every 90 cents they
Right.
put in, they get a dollar out, something like that.
Yeah. So it's some negotiated rate where we get awarded the credits from the state, and then we turn around and sell those credits to the investors, usually banks, because banks are actually required to invest in these credits.
Hmm.
And so they will buy the credits, usually, like Dylan said, like 90 cents on the dollar. And then so we'll basically, let's say we get $10 million in credits, we'll get $9 million in cash to then pay for roughly 40% of the total development cost. And then we will fund the rest. Usually the 50% will be through a loan. So it'll be like a 90% loan to value, a 50% loan to cost. And then the last 10% usually comes from different grants or even like a tax abatement. So we'll go to the local government and they will help finance the project by basically lowering either to zero or close to zero our real estate taxes, our ad valorem real estate taxes for 10, 15, 20 years, whatever we negotiate. And if you know anything about operating expenses, your real estate taxes are usually one of your biggest expenses. And so being able to wipe out that expense for a certain period of time, we can then borrow and basically use the net present value of what that recurring payment
Wow.
would have been for the taxes. We can borrow that in additional loan up front to pay for the development. And then we just pay back that loan over time.
Yeah, it's incredible. It always fascinates me when we talk about this, because I think it's such a powerful vehicle for developers, investors, and yet it's one of the lesser known and talked about models out there. So I'm sure part of it is a barrier to entry, is a lot of intricacies, and it takes a lot to
Yeah.
understand this, right? Versus it's not as hard to figure out how to go and just buy an apartment building as is, or something along those lines, right? So
Right. There's a lot that goes into this. And it's funny, we help mentor others get into this industry, but it is such a niche industry that there's so many nuances and so many rules you have to follow. The best thing I can do or best thing I would recommend to anybody that's even interested would be, first off, make sure you're really seriously interested and passionate about this, because you have to be passionate to be able to put up with all the craziness, all the rules, all the hoops you have to jump through to get the funding and get the development done. But then next, I would say find a great mentor who's already done it. And then third, I would say find a great tax credit counsel or attorney, because they are lifesavers. Like I've been doing this 10 plus years. I still ask my attorney, like, how does certain things work? Probably twice a week. because he is just a wealth of knowledge because he studies this stuff,
Yep.
So having experts, surrounding yourself with experts like that is what I highly recommend, especially with a very nuanced industry like this.
There's so much to it that it's definitely a team sport, right? You're never going to know all the tax credit laws and also know all of the nuances of the development piece of things. Any form of real estate as complex as this, you really have to have the right people on your team, like you said, the right mentors. I want to just talk about the problem of affordable housing again one more time. As you mentioned, rent. We talked about rent control already, right? And you mentioned that the issue with rent control is that if that gets enforced, everyone's putting their shovels down, no one's building anymore, right? Because the economics aren't going to make sense because they know that they're going to be capped at a certain rate and the supply goes away. And then everyone's sitting there with their current supply probably not being reinvested into properly, right? Not being maintained very well. There's case studies of that have happened around the world. And then you're not having new supply. So everyone is just fighting over each other to be able to get into the existing supply. And it just becomes sort of an ugly situation. Now, the other way you see when people think of affordable housing, I think the other thing that gets thrown around quite a bit is Section 8 housing, right? So I wanted to just understand more so maybe how the incentives work with with the LIHTC, the attainable housing model that you have in place. If they start making more money than the target threshold, how does that work? Does that reset every 12 months? You have to verify their income and then they'd have to go to market rate from there. And then maybe just speak to how this model is superior, if you believe it to be so, than a Section 8 voucher.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up because I definitely feel like that's another misnomer of what we do is everybody's like, oh, you're basically building Section 8. But no, that's not in fact what we're doing. We are doing all of our residents that live in a LIHTC or attainable housing development like what we do, they pay their own rent. And so they have to qualify their income. So they have to be in that income range like we talked about for Nashville between roughly 35 to 57,000. And they have to verify that income. And that's kind of an arduous process to confirm that. And so that's one way that we make sure, obviously we want to make sure they can pay for it as well, and they can be able to afford to pay for it. But yes, Section 8 is basically, it's a code within the HUD guidance that is called Section 8, and somehow it got that nickname. But basically Section 8 is, there's two different ways to do Section 8. There's project-based, where it stays with the property, and then there's housing choice voucher, where it stays with the resident and they can move it around wherever a landlord accepts the vouchers.
Right.
And the other misnomer with Section 8 is that it's just 100% pays for their rent. That's not exactly the case for probably the majority of people on Section 8. It actually just covers whatever they can't cover up to whatever the rent amount is. So the residents still pay 30% of their monthly paycheck, but if they're only making $1,000 a month, so they'll pay $300. But if the rent is $800, then the voucher covers the other $500. So it's just a way to allow for people to basically at the very, like at the 0% AMI to like 20 to 30% AMI, be able to still afford rent. And it's a way to basically subsidize part of the rent. But what we do is not Section 8. Sometimes we do actually have Section 8, like a project-based voucher contract for 25% of the units that we do. But yeah, it is different. But it is also not inherently a bad thing to have Section 8.
No, not at all, right? And we have had experiences with Section 8 over the different properties that we've worked on over the years. And, there's certainly pros and cons to it. Certainly, I think some folks that had a lot of Section 8 exposure when COVID hit were happy about that because they had sort of guaranteed payments from the government, right? And there can be some definite upsides from the investor perspective on that. But I also like to talk about just the human element of the incentive systems that are put in place and the impact at a broader scale. And I think what I like about the model that you have in place is that you're still really incentivizing people to get out there and join the working force, add to the job growth in those respective areas. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of people out there that need Section 8, and there's mental disability, there's all kinds of tough family situations where it's a really good thing for us to have in our society. There are also exceptions where people take advantage of Section 8, where they are using that to cover 90%, 80-90% of their rental rate, and if they go and get a job in some cases, then that goes away. So they're sort of incentivized to either work off the books or just not get a job in some cases, right? So I think I think the point I'm making here is that I think the alignment of interest seems to be there from all ends, and I think that's pretty meaningful.
Yeah, and one thing I forgot to add in to your point about like what happens if the resident makes more money the next year. So they do re-verify income every year, but the program is not like trying to de-incentivize individuals or residents from making more money. So if you actually go above the limit, as long as the first year that you're living there, you qualify, then you can continue to stay there as long as you want. So the goal is to allow for people to make more money. Eventually, those individuals, 9 times out of 10, let's say, move out and move on once they hit a certain income level above the affordable rents. But it does, the goal is to try not to, disincentivize economic well-being and economic growth for the families that live there.
Yeah, and even if they are moving out, they're already used to paying for their rent in its entirety out of their own pockets, right? So if they're making more income, it's usually good for them, right? They're now happy to pay a little bit more to move on to another place, right? So I think it's still very much aligns interests, and I think that's why I think this strategy is really something that should be getting more publicity in many ways, as it seems like one of the most viable solutions to be able to solve for the affordability issue that we have going on. So now I want to just speak towards any of our listeners that are active real estate investors. You went on to, you started off working for someone else, and you said that was probably one of the more valuable things that you could have done early on. So maybe speak towards how that had an impact on you, and if you would recommend the same thing for someone that's earlier on in their journey, and any other best practices for active investors that are looking to get started.
Yes, definitely. So a little bit of timeline too. So I basically right out of college, 22 years old, just graduated. That summer I got connected with this developer. And so really I started working for them right when I turned 23, and being able to work, hand in hand with some of the top developers, between all the principals of the company. I think they had done over like 10,000 units by the time I got there. And so to be able to have access, direct access right down the hall, be intimately involved with them on deals and the business decision making at that young of an age, I think that experience was priceless.
Totally.
And I would highly recommend anybody that is considering, especially getting into like a specific industry, like find a mentor and work for them for even just a year or two, just something enough where you get experience, valuable experience, where you see a deal from start to finish, where you see a closing, where you see construction, where you see development, or whatever the industry is. Like find somebody who's really good at it and figure out a way to work for them, because that the more responsibility they give you, the better experience that's going to be. So they really like threw me into the deep end. They're like, hey, like first week, they're like, hey, little 22-year-old Evan, like go source deals. And I didn't know anything, but I was like, well, I want this job and I want to impress them and I want to be successful. Like, I'm going to figure it out. And I, 2 years later, closed a 192 unit development. And that experience, it was a $30 million deal. When I started there, I was like, I didn't even know I could do that. But those are experiences that you get from working for somebody that already knows how to do it. It's just like you exponentially grow through experience and proximity. So I think the mentorship model is highly underrated. I highly recommend anybody considering getting into, especially something where there's not a lot of like public education out there,
Hmm.
like development, real estate development, and affordable housing. There's like, before we started teaching it and mentoring it, like there was nothing online or nothing available from people who knew what they were doing. And so I think working for somebody is one of the quickest ways to be able to tap into that. So I highly recommend it. And just proximity is key.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I think sometimes people think they want to fast track it by going off on their own right away. And the reality is you're going to play at a much smaller playing field at that point, right?
Yep.
You're not going to have investors that are going to back you with large amounts of capital unless you're born into the right family or something. Like
Right.
chances are you're going to be playing on a smaller playing field at that point. You're not going to be learning through the mistakes and experience of others. You're going to be learning through your own mistakes, right? And if you're using your own capital or investor money, you're putting that at risk early on by not having that sort of experience to help you navigate under your belt, and putting your ego aside, and
Yeah.
and just being ready to just not focus on your short-term income and just be focusing on your growth and
Yep.
learning, and then knowing that if you're in the right environment, the rest will take care of itself with time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. I mean, working for that other development company, like I definitely sacrificed income. I sacrificed equity. And I actually had to give up equity to even be able to leave. But I knew that, the grass was greener in the future of what I was doing. And I believed in myself. And I think and like you said, like you're ultimately, you're investing in your education, your experience, which nobody can take away from you. And that's something that you always carry with you. And that's like the most valuable thing you can invest in especially at a young age. Like having experiences in education are priceless.
Completely. Yeah, you could go to work for free if you had the means to do so, and you would still be profiting in the
Yeah.
long run, right? Uh, so give us a peek behind the curtain as to what's going on today and what you're excited about in the next 5-10 years. What's to come? What's your vision looking like?
Yeah. So within this year, we have a goal of closing on 1,000 units of development and acquisitions. The majority of that will be developments. So we have 4 developments we're currently working on that should close in 2022. Those are both affordable, mixed income, and market rate developments. We're doing some really unique projects this year. We're going to be working with groups like Amazon, who has gotten into affordable housing. We're going to do mixed use, like with an entrepreneur center and a co-working place on the first floor, and affordable
Wow.
housing and sustainable development mixed in. We're doing our first for sale development where we're also going to offer a percentage of those for sale townhomes to first time home buyers,
Mm-hmm.
which is something unique that I've never done before. We've never done before, but I'm really excited to get into that because I think that's, everything I've done to date has been for rent, and most of it has been affordable. And
Mm-hmm.
so I see that as like a natural progression of saying, hey, we can offer for rent, but when you're ready, here's our
Mm-hmm.
other product where we offer first time home buyers and offer that, that next ladder up option. So we're just doing a lot of fun, interesting projects. We're looking at like a motel conversion to affordable housing right now.
Nice.
Really just growing the types of deals we do, but keeping it with an impact driven focus, which is really the core of Holladay Ventures. Impact driven and unique, impactful spaces, and creating community around that. So we're doing a lot of projects here in Nashville, but really the next 5-10 years, and really, the middle of this year, we're going to start looking at new markets throughout the Southeast, and looking at Florida and Texas, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Alabama, figuring out where exactly we can add the most value to communities and find those partnerships. But really, we're trying to create, like we talked about earlier, like we're trying to create a movement here, and create community, and eventually create, a whole ecosystem around impact-driven investments. That could possibly be a platform around that. conferences, different things like that. We're like, hey, let's bring together all the people that actually care about impact and want to make an impact with their investment, and so they can do good and do well and get a recession-resistant return all at the same time. So that's what gets me most excited, is like I just can't wait for that, each step of growth along that path, because it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, this stuff gets me fired up. I'm excited. I want to go find a project to JV with you on right now.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Awesome. Well, what's the best place that listeners can find you online and stay plugged in with what you're doing?
Yeah. So the best place to find everything we're working on is evanholladay.com. That's HOLLADAY. And then if you're interested on the investing side, it's holladayventures.com. We work with our impact-driven passive investors there. And then, of course, Monumental Podcast as well, and YouTube.
Awesome. Well, like I said, it's been really, really great to be able to watch your journey. And I know we're still early on in that path. So I'm really, really pumped to see what the next coming years brings. And thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, man. Thank you. And I'm excited to see everything you're rocking and rolling with, and see you guys just put it on the gas pedal and grow like crazy. You guys are crushing it.
I appreciate it. All right. Till next time. Thanks for tuning in and joining us on another episode of Operators and Allocators, hosted by the Requity Group, a vertically integrated private equity real estate company. You can find recordings of all shows along with other resources on our company website, therequitygroup.com, also listed in the show notes. A brief disclaimer to our listeners. Information presented herein is for discussion and illustrative purposes only and is not a recommendation or an offer or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. All investments are subject to risk, and past performance is no guarantee of future results. The views and opinions expressed by the Requity Group speaker are their own as of the date of the recording. Any such views are subject to change at any time based upon market or other conditions. We hope to see you next week.